There is a version of influence you were taught to recognize. Raised voices, obvious pressure, someone telling you what to do and making it clear there will be consequences if you don't. You know how to spot that. Most people do. This is about the other kind, the kind that doesn't raise its voice, the kind that smiles, listens, remembers your birthday, and asks how you're doing, and does all of it with a purpose you will never be shown directly. Dark psychology is not the domain of monsters in movies. It lives in offices, in relationships, in conversations that felt perfectly normal until something quietly stopped feeling right. It works precisely because it looks nothing like what it is. What you're about to hear across 25 chapters is not a manual. It is a map, a way of seeing the invisible architecture of influence that surrounds every human being, including you, including the people you trust most, including yourself. Some of these chapters will make you think of someone specific. That will be uncomfortable. Let it be. Some will make you think of yourself. That will be even more uncomfortable. Let that be too. There is nothing here to fear. Understanding something has never made it more powerful over you, only less. So settle in. 25 quiet revelations, delivered one at a time. By the end, you will not see people differently. Imagine you are in a cafeteria. The food is all the same food it has always been. Nothing has been added, nothing removed. But someone, before the doors opened this morning, rearranged where things sit. The fruit is now at eye level, right at the front. The desserts are still there but tucked further back, requiring a small, deliberate effort to reach. Nobody told you to eat the fruit. Nobody suggested it or rewarded you for choosing it or penalized you for walking past it. The choice when you make it feels entirely your own. And statistically, measurably, predictably, more fruit gets eaten today than it did yesterday. Not because anyone asked, but because someone understood something about how choices actually get made. That someone never spoke to you. And they shaped what you did anyway. This is the quietest kind of influence there is. Not persuasion, which requires a message. Not manipulation in the dramatic sense, which requires concealment and bad faith. Something more structural than either. The simple arrangement of an environment in a way that makes certain choices easier, more natural, more obvious, while leaving every option technically available. The push is invisible because it never arrives as a push. It arrives as the shape of the room, as the order of things, as what happens to be in front of you when you are not thinking carefully about what you are looking for. The mind, for all its complexity, is profoundly sensitive to friction, not in any dramatic way, just in the quiet, constant way of a river finding the lowest ground. Given two options of roughly equal appeal, the one that requires slightly less effort will be chosen at a rate that has almost nothing to do with how much better or worse it actually is. The easier path does not have to be easier by much. A few extra seconds, a slightly longer reach, the mild social awkwardness of asking for the thing that is not already in front of you. These small frictions add up across thousands of small decisions into patterns that look, from the outside, like preferences, like values, like the considered choices of a person who knows what they want. Many of them are simply the path of least resistance, quietly laid by someone else. You see this in the way options are ordered on a form. The box that comes pre-checked represents a decision already made on your behalf, one you have to actively undo rather than actively choose. Most people do not undo it, not because they thought about it and agreed, but because undoing requires a small deliberate act that choosing never did. The default is not a suggestion, it is a steering, and the people who set the default know this, which is precisely why the setting of defaults has become one of the most carefully considered decisions in the design of systems that touch large numbers of people. It runs through the physical world just as thoroughly. The stores that place certain products at eye level and others near the floor. The websites that lead your attention in a specific sequence before you have decided what you came for. The meeting room where the seating arrangement quietly determines who speaks first and who defers, without anyone assigning roles. The city that builds wide roads and narrow footpaths and then observes that its residents choose to drive. The choice was always there. The infrastructure simply made one version of it almost invisible and the other almost automatic. What makes this worth understanding is not so much the scale at which it operates in the world, though the scale is genuinely enormous, but the degree to which it operates without anyone feeling it. The person eating the fruit believes they chose the fruit. The person who ticked the pre-checked box believes they considered the option. The driver believes they prefer driving, and in a narrow sense they are not wrong. Nobody forced anything. The hand moved freely. The choice was made. But the conditions in which the choice was made were not neutral, were never neutral, and the outcome was significantly more predictable than the feeling of free choice suggested. This is the art of the invisible push. It requires no argument to win, because it never starts one. It needs no authority because it never issues a command. It leaves no obvious trace, because the person being steered experiences only themselves, making their own decision, in their own time, for their own reasons. The most effective version of influence has always been the kind that doesn't feel like influence at all. The kind that works not by changing what people want, but by changing what is easy, what is visible, what is already there when attention arrives. Because attention, it turns out, does not arrive into empty space. It arrives into a room that was arranged before you got there. And someone, almost always, did the arranging.
Think about a child who at some point early enough that they cannot remember exactly when, was described as the shy one. Not cruelly, not as a criticism, perhaps even tenderly, by someone who loved them, explaining to another adult why the child was hanging back at a birthday party. The shy one. And the adults nodded with recognition, and the child heard it, or heard something like it enough times that it settled. And from that point forward, something shifted. Not dramatically, but the next time a situation arose that required stepping forward, meeting someone new, speaking in a room full of people, there was something available to explain the hesitation, a name for it, a category it belonged to. And the hesitation, which might have been ordinary and temporary, became something more load-bearing. It became who the child was. Nobody did anything wrong. The name was given gently, and it built a quiet wall anyway. Labels do something to people that direct instruction never quite manages. You can tell someone what to do, and they can resist, argue, ignore, forget. But tell someone what they are, and something different happens. The self, which is always partly a construction, always assembled from the materials available, takes the label in and begins building with it. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually and reliably, in the way that all the most powerful influences work. Below the level of decision, in the place where identity lives, rather than the place where choices are made. This is because the mind has a deep need for internal consistency. Once a belief about the self is in place, the mind works to maintain it. Not out of stubbornness, but out of the same drive toward coherence that shapes all thinking. A self that contradicts itself at every turn is an exhausting and disorienting thing to inhabit. So when a label arrives and gets accepted, even partially, even tentatively, the mind begins selecting for evidence that supports it. The shy child notices every moment of social difficulty and files it under proof. Every moment of ease gets explained away as an exception. The label does not describe a fixed truth. It creates a gravitational pull toward one. The tender version of this is the shy child. The more consequential version runs through adult life in ways people rarely trace back to their source. The employee told early in their career, warmly and with apparent good intent, that they are a details person, a behind-the-scenes person, someone who does their best work supporting others, may spend a decade not pursuing things that required visibility, not because the opportunity never arose, but because the label had quietly drawn a border around what felt like theirs to want. The partner who is told, laughingly, affectionately, that they are the emotional one in the relationship, who slowly stopped trusting their own reactions as information and began experiencing them instead as a known flaw to be managed. The friend who was always called the funny one, who found over time that depth felt somehow off-brand, somehow outside the role the group had given them, and who performed lightness long after the lightness stopped feeling natural. None of these labels arrived with malice. Most arrived with warmth. That is precisely what made them so easy to accept and so difficult to examine later. A label given with love feels like being known, and being known feels good enough that the inaccuracy, if there is any, does not get inspected very carefully at the moment of arrival. The labels given with less warmth work differently, but often just as effectively. The student told they are not a math person absorbs not just a comment about current performance, but a statement about the shape of their mind, one that closes doors before they are ever tried. The child told they are too sensitive learns to distrust the part of themselves that notices things deeply, which is often also the part that connects most genuinely with other people. The person told they are difficult finds that the word follows them internally long after the person who said it is gone, surfacing in moments of conflict as a preemptive verdict. What all of these share is the way they bypass argument entirely. You cannot debate a label the way you debate an opinion. It does not arrive as a claim to be evaluated. It arrives as a description, as a reflection, as the world simply telling you what it sees. And because it arrives that way, it goes somewhere deeper than argument reaches. The most useful thing a person can do with the labels they have been carrying is not to reject them wholesale, but to look at them with genuine curiosity, to ask when the name was given, and by whom, and what they needed to be true at the time, to ask whether the self that has organized itself around the label is a self that was discovered, or a self that was gradually built to fit a name someone else happened to choose. Because the name they gave you is not the only name available, it is simply the one that arrived first.
Someone brings you a gift, unexpected, unsolicited, arriving without any occasion that called for it. A small thing maybe, something thoughtful, something that required them to pay attention to what you like. And the feeling that follows is not purely pleasant. Underneath the warmth of being considered, something else arrives. Quieter, a faint pressure, a sense that something is now slightly unbalanced between you, and that the balance will need at some point to be restored. You did not ask for the gift. You did not agree to whatever the gift creates between you. And yet the feeling of owing something is there, uninvited, as real as if you had signed something. This feeling is not a personality flaw. It is not ingratitude or smallness. It is one of the oldest and most universal social instincts the human mind carries, and certain people understand it well enough to use it with considerable precision. Reciprocity runs deep in human social life for reasons that go back further than recorded history. A group in which favors were exchanged, in which giving created an expectation of return, was a group that could cooperate across time. You help me now, I help you later. The debt and the repayment created bonds, created reliability, created the kind of extended cooperation that no single individual could manage alone. The instinct toward reciprocity was not a weakness. It was the architecture of survival. But architecture can be entered from unexpected directions, because the instinct does not carefully audit whether the original giving was genuine. It does not ask whether the favor was wanted, whether the timing was convenient, whether the giver had something specific in mind when they gave. It simply registers that something was received and that something is now owed. The ledger opens automatically, and once the ledger is open, it exerts a real pull on behavior, sometimes a very strong one, in ways that have nothing to do with what the recipient actually wants to do. The mechanism is straightforward, but its applications are wide. The colleague who helps you with something before you asked, and then later makes a request that sits just outside what you would normally agree to. The acquaintance who has done you several small favors, unrequested, unreciprocated, who now needs something that would cost you more than all the favors combined. The person in a negotiation who gives a concession first, not because it costs them much, but because they know a concession received creates pressure to return one. In each case, the giving was real. In each case, what followed was not coincidence. What makes this particularly effective as a tool of influence is the size asymmetry it can exploit. The gift or favor given does not need to be proportional to the obligation it creates. A small, unsolicited kindness given at the right moment, in the right way, by someone paying attention, can generate a felt debt that far exceeds its actual value. The investment is modest. The leverage it creates is not. And the person on the receiving end rarely traces the trajectory back clearly enough to notice the disproportion, because the debt feels internal. It feels like their own conscience, rather than something that was installed from the outside. The social cost of not repaying is also part of the mechanism, and it is not trivial. The person who receives and does not return is not just carrying a private discomfort. They risk something in the relationship, and sometimes in their broader reputation, that most people find genuinely costly. Being seen as someone who takes without giving back touches something that runs close to identity. So even when the original gift was not wanted, even when the debt feels unfair. The pressure to resolve it can be stronger than the discomfort of whatever the repayment requires. Children learn this early, often without anyone teaching it explicitly. The classmate who shares their lunch creates a soft obligation in the recipient that has nothing to do with hunger. The friend who is always there in difficult moments accumulates a kind of social credit that gets called in, not always consciously, when they need something in return. Most of the time, this is simply the normal texture of human relationship. Give and take, flowing back and forth, building something real over time. The version worth examining is the one that flows in only one direction, where the giving is consistent and the returns expected are consistently larger than what was given, where the favor arrives precisely when you are most vulnerable to feeling grateful, where the help was offered in a way that made declining awkward, so that the debt was created before you had a real chance to choose whether to accept it. The gift you did not ask for is not always just a gift. Sometimes it is the opening move in an arrangement you were never asked to join, and the clearest sign that this is what it is the feeling that comes with it. Not pure warmth, not simple gratitude, but that quiet, slightly uncomfortable sense that you now owe something to someone who made very sure that you would. There is a particular kind of conversation that feels, while it is happening, like one of the best you have ever had. The other person seems to understand you with unusual speed. They track what you are saying not just at the surface level, but underneath it, catching the things you almost said, the frustrations behind the words, the values driving the position. They do not challenge much. They reflect. They find a way to say back what you said, slightly better, slightly more clearly, in a way that makes your own thoughts feel more solid and more correct than they did before you spoke them. You leave the conversation feeling genuinely seen, thinking this person really gets me, thinking you would like to talk to them again. What you may not have noticed is that you did most of the talking, and that almost everything they offered was already yours. Mirroring is one of the oldest and most effective tools of social influence, precisely because it does not feel like influence at all. It feels like connection. It feels like the rare and valuable experience of being truly understood. And that feeling, the feeling of being understood, sits so close to the feeling of being safe that the mind does not always carefully examine the source of it. Understanding feels good in a way that bypasses scrutiny. The person providing it gets credited with insight, with depth, with a quality of attention that most people rarely receive. And that credit, once given, opens doors that argument and charm and even genuine expertise sometimes cannot. The mechanics are simple enough that their power is easy to underestimate. You pay close attention to what someone believes, values, and cares about. You identify the emotional core of their position, the part that carries the most weight for them, and then you reflect it back, not as repetition, but as affirmation. You find ways to say yes to the parts of their worldview they feel least certain others will accept. You meet the opinion they were half afraid to voice with recognition rather than resistance. And the person receiving that recognition feels something that functions neurologically very close to relief. Because most people move through their days with a quiet background hunger to be agreed with, not on every small thing, but on the things that matter to their sense of who they are and how the world works. When that agreement arrives, especially unexpectedly, especially from someone who seemed to have no particular reason to give it, the warmth it produces is disproportionate to the actual content of the exchange. The agreement was not new information. It added nothing to what was already known, but it felt like something. It felt like confirmation that the view is correct and that the person offering the confirmation is someone worth trusting. This is where the flattering mirror does its real work, not in the moment of the reflection, but in what the reflection builds over time. The person who consistently makes you feel understood, whose company consistently leaves you feeling more solid in your own convictions, gradually becomes someone whose judgment you trust in return. Not because they have demonstrated good judgment, but because they have demonstrated good taste in the specific and personal sense of recognizing the value of what you think. And that feels from the inside very similar to wisdom. The political operative who learns what a voter is afraid of and speaks only to that fear, never challenging, only validating, building a felt sense of being the one person in public life who truly understands, is using the same mechanism as the salesperson who agrees with every concern before quietly steering toward the close. as the new acquaintance who seems to share every significant belief you hold, who you find yourself trusting with unusual speed, who turns out to want something from you that you would not have given a stranger. None of these require the mirror to be dishonest about everything. The most effective version involves genuine partial agreement, real areas of shared view, woven together with strategic affirmation of the parts that matter most to the other person. The mix makes it nearly impossible to identify from inside the conversation. The real agreement provides cover for the performed agreement. The warmth is genuine enough that the pattern is invisible. What makes a person resistant to this, not immune, but less easily captured by it, is a specific kind of self-awareness, not suspicion of everyone who agrees with them, but a mild curiosity about the agreements that arrive too easily, about the person who seems to understand them with unusual speed, about the conversation that leaves them feeling unusually validated, unusually certain, unusually warm towards someone they have only just met. The feeling of being understood is real, and it matters, and it is worth seeking in genuine relationships. But understanding requires knowing someone, and knowing someone takes time that a single conversation, however warm, has not yet provided. The mirror that flatters shows you your own face. It shows it clearly, kindly, in the most favorable light available. What it does not show you is who is holding it, and what they are planning to do once you have finished admiring the reflection.
There is a conversation that happens early in certain relationships. Not early in a dramatic way, not an interrogation or an obvious probing, just the ordinary getting to know you exchange that most people move through without much guard because nothing about it feels threatening. You mention, in passing, that you have always struggled with feeling like you are not quite enough in professional settings, or that a particular person in your past left a wound that still has not fully closed, or that there is one specific kind of criticism delivered in a specific kind of tone that lands differently than other criticism does. You say these things because the conversation feels safe, and because sharing them feels like the natural movement toward closeness. The other person listens warmly. They may even share something in return, something that feels equivalent, something that creates the sense of mutual vulnerability and mutual trust. And the conversation moves on, and what you said gets filed somewhere you cannot see. Most people who pay close attention to others do so out of genuine care. The friend who remembers what hurts you remembers it because they want to avoid causing that hurt. The partner who knows your sensitivities knows them because they love you, and love requires that kind of attention. The vast majority of people who learn where you are soft do nothing with the knowledge except handle you more carefully in those places. But attention is a tool, and like all tools, what matters is the hand holding it. There is a particular kind of social intelligence that operates less like warmth and more like cartography. It moves through early conversations not to connect, but to map. It listens for the moments when the voice changes slightly, when the casualness drops and something more exposed surfaces briefly before being covered again. It notices what topics produce a flicker of defensiveness, what kinds of praise seem to land with unusual hunger, what fears sit just beneath the presented confidence. It does not react to these moments visibly. It simply notes them, stores them, moves the conversation forward as though nothing significant just happened. The person doing this may not experience it as predatory. They may simply be someone who finds other people's vulnerabilities naturally interesting, who has learned across a lifetime that knowing where someone is soft is useful in ways that knowing their strengths is not. Strengths are defended. Vulnerabilities are not. A door is a door, regardless of why you noticed it. The stored information sits quietly for days or months, or sometimes years. In ordinary interactions, it never surfaces. The relationship proceeds normally, warmly even, in a way that makes its existence feel entirely safe. And then something changes. A conflict arises. Something is wanted that is not being freely given. And the stored map gets consulted. Not always overtly. The crack in the armor does not always get hit directly. Sometimes it is simply present in the conversation as an implication. A comment made in the right tone that touches the old insecurity without naming it. A moment of withholding warmth precisely when the other person most needs it, from someone who knows exactly how much that particular warmth matters. A public moment in which something private gets referenced lightly, casually, in a way that could be explained away but was aimed with precision. The person on the receiving end often cannot explain clearly what just happened. The comment was not obviously cruel. The withholding was not provable. The reference could have been innocent. But something landed. Something that found the exact coordinates of an old wound. And the effect was real, even if the mechanism stayed invisible. They feel suddenly less steady, more eager to resolve things, more willing to give something they had not intended to give, to restore the warmth that was withdrawn, to move away from the exposure that was quietly threatened. This is what the stored map is for. Not necessarily for dramatic confrontation, more often just for calibration, for keeping another person in a state of mild uncertainty about whether they are safe, which is one of the most effective ways of maintaining influence over them, without ever doing anything that could be clearly identified as harm. The protection against this is not the closing off of vulnerability entirely. A person who shares nothing, trusts no one, keeps every soft place hidden, is not protected. They are simply isolated, which is its own kind of damage. Genuine closeness requires genuine exposure. The answer is not to stop being knowable, it is to pay attention to what happens to the things you share, whether they are held carefully or filed away, whether the person who received your vulnerability seems to carry it with care, or with something cooler than care, whether over time what you shared in softness ever gets used in hardness. Trust is not given in one moment. It is built across many. And one of the clearest ways to read it accurately is to notice not how someone treats you when things are easy and warm, but what they reach for when they want something you have not yet agreed to give. There is a version of this that begins so gradually, it has no clear starting point. You are in a relationship, a friendship, or a romantic one, or a professional one, and early on your opinions are present. You have views, you express them, sometimes they differ from the other person's, and the difference sits fine between you. But somewhere along the way, so slowly that no single moment marks the change, something begins to shift. Your opinion gets questioned often enough that you start questioning it yourself before you speak. Your reading of the situation turns out to be wrong, according to the other person, with a consistency that begins to feel like evidence. You start to preface what you think with qualifiers. You find yourself checking more and more before trusting your own read. And one day, without any single thing you can point to, you realize that you no longer feel certain about what you think, that your own judgment has become somehow suspect to you, that the clearest signal you receive about whether something is right or wrong comes not from inside yourself, but from the reaction of the person standing in front of you. The erosion of self-trust is rarely the result of one blow, one dramatic moment of being told you are wrong. One clear and obvious undermining is actually easier to identify and resist than what usually happens, which is accumulation. The quiet, patient accumulation of small moments that individually seem unremarkable, but collectively do something that a single confrontation never could. The correction delivered just often enough to feel like care rather than control. The raised eyebrow that greets your opinion before the opinion has finished forming. The way your take on a situation is received with a kind of patient tolerance that implies it is not quite sophisticated enough to be taken seriously. The gentle suggestion, repeated across months, that you tend to be too sensitive, too reactive, too quick to conclusions, until the very act of having a strong feeling begins to feel like evidence of a flaw rather than a source of information. None of these in isolation is an event. They are textures, the texture of a dynamic, accumulated over time, that quietly teaches a person to distrust the instrument they use to navigate everything, their own mind. What makes this particularly difficult to see from inside is that some of the corrections, some of the challenges, were probably accurate. You were wrong sometimes. Your reading of certain situations was off. Your emotions did occasionally lead you to conclusions that did not hold. and those accurate corrections get mixed into the same accumulation as the inaccurate ones, making the whole pattern feel like genuine feedback rather than a systematic dismantling. The person doing it may not even know they are doing it. The effect is the same either way, because the outcome is not a person who has learned to think more carefully. It is a person who has learned to think less, who has outsourced the final authority on their own experience to someone else, who now moves through situations with a background hum of self-doubt that was not there before, and that feels, because it arrived so slowly, like something they discovered about themselves, rather than something that was installed. This matters because judgment is not a fixed thing. It is more like a muscle that requires use to stay functional, and atrophies when consistently bypassed. The person who stops trusting their own read of situations stops practicing the reading. They become slower to form a view, quicker to abandon it, more reliant on external confirmation for things that used to feel navigable from the inside. The confidence does not just feel gone. Over time, in a functional sense, it partly is. Rebuilding it is slower than losing it was. There is no single moment of reclaiming. It happens the same way the erosion happened, through accumulation, but in the opposite direction. Through small, repeated acts of trusting your own read, even when it feels uncertain. Through noticing when the doubt arrives and asking whether it comes from genuine reconsideration or from the old learned reflex of expecting to be wrong. Through staying with your own conclusion long enough to actually examine it, rather than surrendering it the moment it meets resistance. The signal that something real is happening to your judgment is not the dramatic one. It is not a moment of obvious cruelty or clear manipulation. It is quieter than that. It is the moment you notice that you no longer say what you think until you have checked whether it will be well received. That you have started editing yourself before the thought is fully formed. That the version of you that speaks is a cautious, pre-approved version, and the version that actually thinks has gone somewhere quieter. Your judgment is not the problem. The erosion of your trust in it is. And the two things, though they arrive together, are not the same. One of them was always worth trusting. It was simply taught, very patiently, to doubt itself.
Think about a conflict between two people that you heard about secondhand. Someone told you what happened, walked you through the sequence of events, explained who said what and who did what, and how it all fell apart. And you formed a picture, a clear enough picture, with a shape to it, a sense of who was reasonable and who was not, who handled things well and who made it worse. You were not there. You only heard one account. And yet the picture felt solid, complete enough to hold a judgment. Now consider that the other person in that conflict, the one you heard less about, had their own account, with its own sequence, its own context, its own explanation for the moments that looked worst in the version you received. You never heard that account, but it existed, and it would have built a different picture. The person who spoke to you spoke last, and the person who speaks last builds the picture everyone else carries. This is a simpler mechanism than most forms of influence, but its simplicity is precisely what makes it so consistently effective. Narrative is not a neutral record of events. It is a construction, shaped by what gets included and what gets left out, by where the story begins and where it ends, by the tone in which certain moments are described and the weight given to certain details over others. Two people can describe the same sequence of events and produce accounts so different that a listener would struggle to recognize them as the same events at all. Neither account needs to be dishonest. Selection alone does the shaping. The person who controls the final account controls the version that settles in the minds of everyone who was not present to form their own. And in most conflicts, most disagreements, most moments where a reputation is at stake or a relationship is being interpreted by people outside it, one person speaks and the other does not. One person reaches the audience first, or most consistently, or with the most emotional clarity, and the story that audience carries is the story that person told. This is why the timing and placement of a final word matters so much more than most people realize when they are in the middle of a difficult situation. The natural impulse, when hurt or wronged or misrepresented, is to respond immediately, to correct the record while the original account is still fresh, to meet the version being circulated with the version that feels more accurate. But immediacy is not always advantage. A response delivered in heat, in hurt, in the full emotional texture of someone who has just been painted badly, can confirm the very picture it was trying to correct. The agitation reads as instability. The passion reads as grievance. The correction reads as defensiveness. The person who waits, who lets the initial account settle, with apparent generosity toward the other party, who frames their version not as a rebuttal, but as simply a fuller picture. That person builds something the first account could not. They build the impression of someone who has perspective, who is not rattled, who is telling the story from a place of clarity rather than injury. And that impression, that tone, carries independent weight before the content of what they say has even registered. The audience is already oriented toward trust before the actual account begins. History is written this way at every scale. The leader who controls the record of a decision controls how the decision is judged when its consequences arrive. The colleague who gets to the shared manager first shapes the frame through which the subsequent conversation happens. The partner who speaks to friends about a deteriorating relationship builds a version of events that those friends will hold, mostly unchanged, long after the relationship ends, and long after anything more accurate might have been offered. There is a particular cruelty available in this mechanism that requires no raised voice, no obvious aggression, nothing that could be pointed to later as an attack. Simply tell the story first. Tell it calmly. Tell it with just enough generosity toward the other person to seem fair, while still placing the weight exactly where it needs to go. Let the audience form their own conclusion from the materials provided, and then allow the silence of the other party, who has not yet spoken, or who spoke less effectively, to function as confirmation. The villain of any story is often simply the person who did not get to shape it, not because they were worse, but because they spoke to an audience that had already been given a map, and their words arrived as features in someone else's landscape, rather than as a landscape of their own. Knowing this does not require becoming someone who races to control every narrative. Most people are not equipped for that, and most situations do not warrant it. But it is worth understanding what is actually at stake in the moments when a story about you is being told without you, when someone else is speaking last, when the picture being built in the minds of people who matter is being assembled from materials you never got to provide. The final word is not just a conclusion, it is an architecture, and the person who builds it decides who lives inside it as the hero and who does not.
There is a particular kind of generous person who is wonderful to be around in the early stages of knowing them. They give freely, ask for little, show up when needed, offer things before you have thought to ask. The relationship feels easy in a way that good relationships do feel easy, without the careful accounting, without the constant weighing of who gave what and who owes whom. You relax into it. You receive the generosity in good faith because it is offered in what appears to be good faith. And for a while, sometimes a long while, nothing suggests that the appearance and the reality are anything other than the same thing. And then something shifts. It may be a specific moment, or it may be a slow change in temperature. The generosity begins to carry a different quality, not withdrawn exactly, but referenced. The things given start to appear in conversation in ways they did not before, not as accusations, not yet, but as inventory, a quiet cataloging of what has flowed in one direction. And somewhere in that cataloging, for the first time, you feel the clock. You realize it was always running. You simply were not told it had been started. Genuine generosity and performed generosity can look identical for a very long time. They have the same surface, the same warmth, the same apparent selflessness, the same quality of making the recipient feel cared for. The difference lives not in the giving, but in what the giver carries while giving. Whether the act is complete in itself, offered and released, or whether it is an investment, given with the full intention of return, held privately against the moment when the return will be needed. The investment version is not always conscious. Some people who give with a clock do not know the clock is there. They have learned, somewhere along the way, that generosity is a currency, that giving creates a form of power over the receiver, and they operate from that learning without ever having examined it clearly or named it to themselves. The giving feels genuine in the moment. The expectation of return feels, when it arrives, like simple fairness. They gave, the other person received. Return seems only reasonable. What makes the clock invisible for so long is that the early generosity is often real in its texture. The attention was genuine. The time given was actually given. The help provided actually helped. There is no performance in the act itself, only in the accounting that runs silently alongside it. And because the act was real, the recipient has no reason to question the framing. Generosity was received. Warmth was felt. The relationship was built on something that felt solid. The bill arrives in many forms. Sometimes it is explicit, a moment where past giving is listed openly, and a return is requested with the list as justification. A withdrawal of warmth, at a moment when warmth is most needed, combined with a reference to how much has been given, creates a pressure that does not need to be stated directly. The recipient feels the gap between the previous warmth and the current coolness, and works, often without realizing they are working, to close it, to restore what was there, to give whatever is being waited for, so that the temperature returns to what it was. This is the mechanism at its most efficient. The withdrawal does not need to be total or dramatic. A partial withdrawal from someone whose warmth you have come to rely on creates a very specific kind of anxiety that is hard to sit with and easy to resolve by compliance. And compliance, once given once, establishes a pattern. The clock has now been acknowledged, the debt has now been paid, and the next round of generosity can begin, building the next balance that will eventually come due. Children raised by this pattern learn something deeply confusing about love. They learn that warmth is conditional in a way that is never explicitly stated, that care arrives in cycles with invisible strings, that the safest response to generosity is anxiety rather than gratitude, because the bill will come and its size will be unknown until it arrives. They grow into adults who find it difficult to receive anything freely, who wait for the catch in every kindness, who sometimes push away genuine generosity because the body learned long ago that what looks like a gift is usually a loan. The clearest signal that generosity carries a clock is not the giving itself, but what happens when you cannot or will not pay, when circumstances prevent the return, or when you simply decline to provide what is being waited for, and the response is not understanding, but injury, not acceptance, but withdrawal. The nature of the original giving reveals itself. What looked like care was closer to contract. What felt like warmth was closer to investment. Real generosity does not keep records. It gives and releases. It does not carry the giving forward into future conversations as evidence of what is owed. It does not cool when the return is delayed. It simply gives and lets the giving be finished. The kindness with a clock gives the same way, but somewhere behind the warmth, a small, quiet mechanism is counting, and it never stops until it is paid.
There is a particular kind of remark that arrives in the shape of curiosity. It has a question mark at the end, or the rising tone of one, and on the surface, it looks like someone simply wondering about something. Are you sure that is what you want to do? Do you really think that is a good idea? Is that what you're going to wear? Did you actually check that before you sent it? Each one taken in isolation could be genuine inquiry, could be care, could be the reasonable concern of someone paying attention on your behalf. But something lands underneath the words that the words themselves do not contain. A suggestion, a seed of doubt that was not there before the question arrived. You were sure, a moment ago. You had decided, felt settled, moved forward with a reasonable degree of confidence. And now, without being told you were wrong, without a single direct challenge you could respond to, you are less sure than you were. The question did not give you new information. It simply made the information you had feel suddenly insufficient. This is one of the most elegant tools in the architecture of subtle influence because it carries built-in deniability. A direct accusation can be argued with. A clear statement of doubt can be examined for its basis. But a question deflects all of that. It was just a question. They were only asking. If you feel undermined, that is something in you, some sensitivity, some defensiveness, some insecurity that the question merely revealed rather than created. The weapon, by the time it has landed, has become invisible. What remains is only the wound, sitting in the recipient who cannot point to the blow. The phrasing is usually careful in ways that are worth paying attention to. Really is a word that appears often. Are you really sure? Do you really think? Did you really check? The really does something small but precise. It introduces a gap between whatever level of certainty you had and a higher level that is being implied as the appropriate standard. It suggests that ordinary confidence is not quite enough, that a more rigorous certainty should be present before you proceed, and that its absence is worth examining. One word, an enormous amount of quiet pressure inside it. The same work gets done by emphasis placed in particular locations. You are going to do it that way? The stress on that creates an implied alternative, a better way, unstated, hanging in the air where you can feel it but cannot address it because it was never said. You decide to do it that way carries all your own agency. You are going to do it that way removes the agency and replaces it with mild bewilderment that this is the path being chosen. Nothing was said. Something was communicated with precision. This extends into the question that imports an assumption. Have you thought about how this might affect other people? The question is about your consideration for others, which sounds reasonable on the surface. But embedded in it is the assumption that you probably have not thought about it. That the thinking would reveal a problem, and that a person with better judgment would have arrived at this conversation already having resolved that problem. The question does not ask whether you considered others, it suggests through its very asking that you did not. Groups use this on individuals, partners use this on each other, parents use this on children, and children, growing up inside it, learn to move through the world pre-defending their choices against questions that have not yet arrived. They develop a particular internal posture, slightly braced, slightly apologetic, always preparing the justification before anyone has asked for it. Because the questions that were not questions taught them that confidence without armor is confidence waiting to be punctured. The cumulative effect of living inside this particular dynamic is a specific kind of mental exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of having been in many arguments, but the exhaustion of having never quite been in one, never having had a clear surface to push back against, always finding that the doubt arrived through a door that looked like something else. The groundlessness of it is the point. You cannot refute a question. You cannot argue with curiosity. You can only absorb the doubt it leaves and carry it forward into the next decision, where it will have made you slightly more hesitant than you were before. Becoming harder to move with this particular tool does not require becoming defensive or treating all questions as attacks. Most questions are questions. Most curiosity is genuine, and most concern is real. The distinction sits in the pattern, in what happens after you answer, in whether the question was actually seeking information or seeking something else entirely. The question that is genuinely curious accepts the answer. It takes in what you say, updates, moves forward. The question that was never a question does none of that. The answer you give gets met with another question that suggests the answer was insufficient, or a silence that implies it, or a slight expression that lands in the space where acknowledgement should have been, because it was not waiting for your answer, it was waiting for your doubt. And the moment it found it, there is a particular kind of relationship where the rules keep moving. Not dramatically, not in ways that could be pointed to clearly and named, but in the small, daily ways that make a person feel perpetually slightly off balance. What was welcomed yesterday is met with coolness today. The thing that seemed to matter last week no longer seems to matter, and something that was never mentioned before has become important. You adjust, you recalibrate, you try to find the stable ground and stand on it. And just as you think you have found it, something shifts again, not enough to cause a scene about, just enough to keep you looking down, checking your footing, uncertain whether the ground beneath you is solid. The uncertainty is not accidental, and the dependency it creates is not a side effect. It is the point. Human beings are remarkably poor at tolerating unresolved uncertainty in relationships that matter to them. This is not a weakness in any simple sense. It is the social equivalent of the same drive that makes the mind seek patterns in randomness, the same deep need for the world to be readable, for the behavior of the people you depend on to follow some logic you can understand and predict. When that logic is present, even if it is demanding, even if it requires things of you, you can orient yourself around it. You know where you stand, and knowing where you stand, even on difficult ground, is manageable in a way that not knowing is not. The confusion works precisely because the person inside it cannot stop trying to resolve it. Every new interaction becomes data, examined carefully for what it reveals about the current rules, about what is needed today, about what will restore the warmth, or avoid the coolness, or produce the approval that keeps arriving just inconsistently enough to feel worth pursuing. The mind cannot let it go because letting it go would mean accepting a level of unresolvable uncertainty that feels, to the part of the brain that monitors attachment and safety, like a genuine threat. This is what makes inconsistency, rather than consistent harshness, so effective as a tool of control. Consistent harshness is legible. It can be named, planned around, eventually left. The person on the receiving end of consistent unkindness at least knows what they are dealing with. But inconsistency has no stable shape to push against. The warmth is real when it comes. The coldness is real when it comes. The person experiencing the alternation is not imagining either one, and the oscillation between them creates something that consistent treatment of any kind never could, which is a state of permanent alert, permanent readjustment, permanent focus on the source of the inconsistency as the primary reference point for how things are going. Attention, once organized this way, is very difficult to redirect. The person who is trying to decode a confusing dynamic has less available for everything else, for their own thinking, their own assessment of whether the relationship is actually serving them, their own voice in decisions that affect them. The confusion occupies the foreground in a way that pushes everything else to the back, and in that narrowed attentional field, the person creating the confusion becomes enormous, central, the axis around which the day turns. The practical expressions of this are various. The manager whose feedback is never quite clear enough to act on definitively, which means the employee keeps returning for more guidance, more approval, more orientation. The partner whose emotional availability follows no predictable pattern, which means the other person organizes their behavior almost entirely around reading and responding to shifts in mood. The parent whose love felt real, but whose approval arrived without discernible logic, which produces an adult who has spent decades trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution because the puzzle was the point. In each case, the person creating the confusion may or may not be aware of its effect. Some do it with full knowledge of what the inconsistency produces. Others simply operate from their own unexamined patterns, their own needs, their own discomfort, with the kind of clarity that would give the other person stable ground to stand on. The effect on the person inside the confusion is the same regardless of the intent behind it. The way out is not more careful decoding of the shifting signals. That is the trap, the endless attempt to find the pattern that will finally make the behavior predictable. The way out is the recognition that the confusion itself is information, that a relationship which consistently leaves you uncertain about where you stand, uncertain about the rules, uncertain about what version of this person will show up today, is a relationship organized around your uncertainty rather than your well-being. Clarity in a relationship is not a luxury. It is the minimum condition for trusting your own experience inside it. When clarity is consistently withheld, something is being withheld deliberately, and the confusion you feel is not a problem you have failed to solve. It is a condition someone else requires you to live in. Because a person who knows where they stand can decide whether to stay there, and a person who never quite knows cannot. There is a period at the beginning of certain relationships that feels, while it is happening, like something you have never quite experienced before. The attention is total. The appreciation seems genuine and specific, not generic flattery, but the kind that demonstrates someone has actually been watching, actually been listening, actually understood something about you that most people miss. You are seen in the way you have perhaps always wanted to be seen. Your qualities are named and valued. Your presence seems to genuinely matter to this person in a way that feels different from how you have mattered to others. It feels like arrival, like finally being recognized for what you actually are, and it is intoxicating in a way that makes careful observation very difficult. Because the thing about being truly seen or feeling truly seen is that it loosens something, the guard that most people carry through ordinary interactions, the reasonable caution that keeps full trust withheld until it has been earned across time. That guard has a hard time staying up when everything around it is confirming that this, finally, is a safe place to put it down. The pedestal is built carefully, not with obvious flattery, which most people can identify and resist, but with something more precise. Specific observations that demonstrate attention, comparisons that place you above others in ways that feel earned rather than performed, a quality of focus that communicates, without stating it directly, that you are unusual, that not everyone receives this kind of regard, that something about you specifically called it forth. The implied exclusivity is part of the architecture. You are not simply liked, you are recognized, and recognition, when it arrives with that kind of apparent depth, touches something that flattery never reaches. What is being built during this period, though it will not be visible until much later, is a specific kind of vulnerability. Not the ordinary vulnerability of caring about someone, which is simply the cost of connection and cannot be avoided, but a deeper one, a dependency on the particular quality of regard being offered. The pedestal creates a new baseline, a new standard for how it feels to be known and valued. And once that standard exists, once the nervous system has calibrated to that level of attention and appreciation, ordinary regard begins to feel like neglect. The warmth available in other relationships, which was sufficient before, now registers as insufficient by comparison. The pedestal does not only elevate you in the moment, it quietly lowers everything else. This matters enormously for what comes next, because the pedestal is not a permanent structure. It was never intended to be. It is a first act, and first acts exist to make second acts possible. The transition rarely arrives as a single dramatic reversal. It comes as a series of small adjustments. The attention that was total becomes slightly less total. The appreciation that was specific and frequent becomes more occasional. A mild criticism appears where none existed before. Nothing harsh, just a gentle noting of a flaw, small enough to seem like honesty rather than attack. And the person on the pedestal, having calibrated to the previous standard, feels the reduction acutely, feels it as loss, feels it as a question about whether the original recognition was accurate, whether the thing that was seen in them is still visible, whether they have somehow failed to maintain whatever it was that called forth that extraordinary regard. The work of getting back to the pedestal begins almost automatically, not as a conscious strategy, but as an emotional response to the felt reduction. More effort, more accommodation, more willingness to overlook things that in a different state would register as worth addressing. Because the goal, the one the nervous system is now organized around, is restoration, return to the baseline that was established during the elevation. And that goal makes the person extraordinarily manageable. They are no longer operating from their own center. They are operating from the gap between where they are and where they were, trying to close it. The criticism, when it comes more regularly now, lands differently than criticism from other sources. It lands against the backdrop of having been so specifically valued, which means it carries an authority that ordinary criticism does not. If someone who saw you so clearly now sees a flaw, the flaw must be real. If someone who appreciated you so specifically is now disappointed, the disappointment must be deserved. The pedestal, in retrospect, was not a gift. It was a calibration, a way of establishing credibility for every verdict that followed. Not every idealization is strategy. Some people simply love intensely at the beginning and cannot sustain it. Some idealize because they need to, because the image of a perfect partner or friend serves something in them, and the disillusionment that follows is as painful for them as for the person who was idealized. These are real dynamics, and they cause real harm without any intent to manipulate. But there is a version where the elevation was always in service of the fall, where the pedestal was built with the full knowledge that what it creates is a person whose sense of themselves becomes dependent on the regard of the one who built it. Because a person who needs you to see them clearly will do almost anything to stay in your line of sight, and a person who built the pedestal always knew exactly where to look to find them.
Think about the last time you made a decision that felt entirely your own, in a place that was specifically designed for you to make it. A car showroom, perhaps, where the lighting is warm and the car sits at exactly the right angle, and the salesperson guides you through a sequence of small agreements before the large one arrives. Or a casino floor where there are no clocks and no windows, and the sounds around you are engineered to keep the nervous system at a particular pitch of alert excitement. Or a doctor's waiting room, where the specific quality of silence and the particular arrangement of space communicates, before a word is spoken, that the appropriate posture here is patience and deference. You walked into each of these spaces and made choices inside them. The choices felt like yours. They were yours in the narrow sense that no one forced your hand, but the room was not neutral. The room was working, and the work it was doing was so embedded in the physical fact of being there that it never needed to announce itself. Environments shape behavior with a consistency and efficiency that direct instruction rarely matches. This is not a new observation. Architects have known it, rulers have known it, merchants have known it, for as long as there have been buildings to arrange and people to move through them. The placement of a door determines traffic. The height of a ceiling changes how expansive or constrained thinking feels. The temperature of a room affects how generous or guarded people are with each other. The distance between seats determines whether strangers become acquaintances or remain strangers. None of these effects require awareness to operate. The person inside the room does not need to notice the ceiling to think differently under a high one. What makes this worth sitting with carefully is the degree to which the engineering has become precise. The understanding of how environments produce behavior has moved over time, from intuition to science. The warmth of light in a retail space has been tested against sales figures. The path through a furniture showroom has been designed to expose you to the maximum number of products before you reach the exit. The layout of a supermarket places the things you came for at the back, requiring you to move through everything you did not come for to reach them. Each of these is a room you are in without knowing you are in it, in the sense that matters, which is that its influence runs without your awareness or consent. The digital version of this is simply the same principle without walls. The sequence in which options are presented on a screen, the color of a button, the number of steps required to cancel something versus the single step required to continue it, the notification that arrives at the moment when resistance is lowest, the feed that has been arranged not chronologically, but in the order most likely to keep you inside it. These are rooms too. Rooms with no visible architecture, which makes their shaping of behavior harder to feel and therefore harder to resist. What the engineered environment exploits is the same thing all effective influence exploits. The gap between the deliberate, effortful thinking that makes genuinely considered choices and the automatic, frictionless behavior that the mind defaults to when it is not specifically prompted to do otherwise. Deliberate thinking is slow and expensive. The mind rations it, and the environment, whether physical or digital, is always offering an easier path, a nudge in a particular direction that costs nothing to follow and something to resist. Most of the time, the something is small enough that resistance does not feel worth it. And so the direction is followed, and the choice is made, and it feels like preference rather than engineering. The more consequential version of this runs not in showrooms or casinos, but in the social environments that shape identity over time. The family structure that makes certain kinds of self-expression feel natural and others feel dangerous. The workplace culture that makes particular ambitions feel appropriate and others feel presumptuous. The community that arranges its warmth and belonging in a way that makes staying feel like home and leaving feel like exile. These are rooms too. Rooms built not from walls and lighting, but from relationship and expectation and the accumulated weight of what happens when you move within them versus against them. The person who grows up in a room that was designed to produce a particular kind of person does not experience it as design. They experience it as reality, as simply the way things are. The constraints feel like the shape of the world rather than the shape of a room. And when they eventually encounter a different room, one where the same behaviors produce different responses, the disorientation can be profound. Not because anything about them changed, but because the room changed. And the room all along was doing more of the deciding than they knew. Seeing the room does not immediately free you from it. The environment continues to exert its pressure, whether you are aware of it or not. But awareness does something. It introduces a small gap between the nudge and the response, a moment of noticing, however brief, that a direction is being suggested before the direction is taken. That gap is not nothing. In a room that was designed to close it entirely, even a moment of noticing is a kind of freedom, the smallest kind, but still.
There is something that happens in certain long relationships that is difficult to name while you are inside it. The person you are with has a version of you, not a cruel version necessarily, not a cartoon of your worst qualities, but a specific and fixed version, one that knows what you are like in advance, that can finish your sentences not because they know you deeply, but because they have decided who you are and the decision has hardened into certainty. You try something new, and the response is mild surprise, quickly absorbed into the existing picture. You behave in a way that contradicts the version, and it gets explained away, treated as an exception, filed as an anomaly rather than information. The version holds. You shift around it. And slowly, without any single moment you can point to, you begin to wonder whether the version is right, not because the evidence supports it, but because it has been stated so many times by someone whose opinion you trusted that the repetition has begun to feel like proof. The self is not as solid as it feels. This is one of those things that sounds destabilizing, but is actually, once you sit with it fully, something closer to liberating. The sense of who you are, the continuous felt experience of being a specific person with specific qualities and specific limits, is partly constructed. It is assembled from experience and reflection and the responses of the world around you, and it requires a degree of ongoing input from that world to stay stable. which means it is vulnerable in a specific and important way to the sustained input of people who matter to you. When someone trusted, a parent, a partner, a close friend, a person whose regard you have organized part of your life around, tells you repeatedly what you are like, something happens that goes beyond ordinary disagreement or ordinary feedback. The repetition does not just present a view for you to accept or reject. It accumulates, it builds pressure. And the pressure over time works on the self the way water works on stone, not by force, but by persistence, by the simple fact of being there, again and again, in the voice of someone whose perception you have been taught or have chosen to trust. You are too sensitive. You are not good with money. You are the kind of person who always does this. You have never been able to handle that. Each statement, delivered with the calm authority of someone who has known you for a long time, carries more weight than the same statement from a stranger would. The stranger can be dismissed. The trusted person cannot be dismissed as easily without also dismissing the relationship. And the relationship is worth something, costs something to damage, and so the statement gets absorbed instead, filed not as their opinion, but as possible truth. And possible truth, revisited often enough, becomes working truth. The thing you operate from, even when you have not consciously agreed to it. Children are the most vulnerable to this because they have the least prior self to weigh the incoming version against. A child being told what they are like by the adults who define their world has almost no independent reference point. The version arrives early into largely open space, and it sets before anything more accurate has a chance to form. The child who is told they were difficult grows into an adult who expects to be experienced as difficult, who pre-apologizes, who shrinks in situations that require them to take up space, who carries the version so deep inside that they have long since stopped recognizing it as something that was given to them rather than something they discovered about themselves. But this does not only happen in childhood, it happens in adult relationships that last long enough and carry enough weight. The partner who is told, consistently and with apparent affection, that they are not quite competent in certain areas begins to defer in those areas, not because the assessment was accurate, but because the voice delivering it was close enough and trusted enough and consistent enough that deferring became simpler than the sustained effort of resisting. The resistance requires maintaining your own version of yourself against the pressure of someone else's, and that maintenance is tiring in a way that surrender is not. The invented version often contains enough truth to be credible. This is what makes it so difficult to see clearly. The person who knows you has observed you. They have data. Some of what they reflect back is accurate, or was accurate once, or is accurate in certain conditions. And that partial accuracy provides cover for the parts that are not accurate, that were never accurate, that serve a purpose in the relationship that has nothing to do with seeing you clearly. The truth in the version makes the distortion invisible. Recognizing that a version of you was invented does not require vilifying the person who invented it. Some people construct a fixed version of those they love out of fear, out of their own need for predictability, out of an inability to tolerate the uncertainty of someone they depend on continuing to change and surprise them. The invention is not always malicious. It is sometimes simply the shape of their limitation. But the version they built is not you. It is a room they put you in. And rooms, however long you have lived in them, are not the same thing as your actual dimensions. The question worth carrying is simple but not easy. Of the things you believe about yourself most deeply, the limits you do not question, the qualities you treat as simply given, how many of them did you discover? And how many were handed to you by someone who needed you to be that way? There is a specific kind of silence that most people have felt at least once and never quite forgotten. You have said something, made a request, expressed a view, admitted something that cost you something to admit. And the person on the other side of it does not respond, not immediately. The pause extends past the point where a normal pause would end, past the moment where you expected something back, into a length of quiet that begins to have a quality to it, a texture. The silence is no longer simply the absence of words. It has become a presence. And in that presence, something in you begins to move. You start to fill the gap, not out loud, not yet, but internally. You revisit what you said. You look for the thing that might have caused the silence. You consider whether you expressed it wrong, whether the timing was off, whether something you thought was reasonable has revealed itself, through the quality of this quiet, to have been something else entirely. The silence has not told you any of this. It has not said anything. but it has produced in you a state of uncertainty and low-level anxiety that is doing the work of an argument without any of the effort. Most people understand silence as the absence of communication, but silence is always communication. It is simply communication that carries no explicit content, which means the recipient has to supply the content themselves, and the content they supply almost always comes from the most anxious, most self-doubting part of their mind. The silence creates a vacuum, and the vacuum gets filled with whatever the listener most fears might be true, which makes silence, deployed at the right moment, one of the most targeted and efficient pressure tools available in any relationship. The reason it works so reliably connects to something deep in how human beings are wired for social connection. Silence from someone who usually responds, especially silence that follows something personally significant, registers in the nervous system not as neutral, but as threatening. The social brain monitors for responses from the people it is attached to. It expects responsiveness. It has learned from the very beginning of life that silence from a caregiver in a moment of need is a signal that something is wrong. That attunement has broken down, that repair is needed, and the instinct to repair, to do whatever it takes to restore the responsiveness, runs faster and deeper than conscious reasoning can easily override. So when the silence arrives, the instinct activates before the thinking does. The discomfort is immediate and physical in a way that the discomfort from a direct argument is not. An argument gives you something to push back against, a position to engage, a surface to meet with your own position. Silence gives you nothing. Nothing except the feeling, somewhere in the body, that something is wrong and that you are probably the reason. The person using silence this way may or may not be doing it deliberately. Some people have simply learned, without ever examining the learning, that going quiet when they are displeased produces results that arguing does not. The other person softens, backtracks, offers more, becomes more accommodating. The silence worked, and so the silence became a tool, carried forward through relationship after relationship, without ever being consciously chosen or examined. For others, it is more deliberate, a known technique applied with full awareness of the pressure it creates. Either way, the recipient is navigating the same experience. The silence lands, the anxiety follows. The urge to resolve the silence, to say something that fills it, to give something that ends it, arrives before any clear thought about whether giving that something is actually what the situation warrants. This is where the most useful thing happens, the thing the silence was designed to prevent. If you can resist the urge to fill the silence immediately, if you can sit in the discomfort of the unresolved quiet long enough to actually think, a different kind of information becomes available. Not the information the silence was supplying, which was anxiety-generated and self-critical and probably not accurate, but actual information about whether what you originally said was actually wrong, about whether the silence is a genuine response to something worth reconsidering or a pressure tactic applied to something that did not warrant it. Because silence is not verdict. It feels like one. It carries the emotional weight of one, but the feeling and the fact are not the same thing. The silence tells you that the other person chose not to speak. It tells you nothing else with any reliability. The relationships where silence is regularly used this way develop a particular texture over time. The person on the receiving end becomes attuned, in a way that costs them, to the smallest shifts in the other person's responsiveness. A normal pause becomes loaded. A moment of distraction gets read as potential withdrawal. The nervous system, having learned that silence is dangerous, begins scanning for it constantly, treating ordinary quiet as potential threat, never quite relaxing into the safety that relationships are supposed to provide. There is a kind of strength available in learning to sit with the silence without immediately moving to end it. Not a cold strength, not the performance of being unbothered, but a genuine tolerance for the discomfort of waiting, of not filling the gap with apology or retraction or the offering up of something that was not actually owed. The silence is asking you to speak first, to give something, to resolve the tension by moving toward it. And sometimes, the most honest response to that pressure is the one thing the silence was designed to prevent, which is your own silence, patient and steady, waiting for words that are actually true.
It begins with something that sounds like care. A comment about a friend. Nothing harsh, just a mild observation. That person does not seem to bring out the best in you. Or a question, gently asked, about whether someone in your life is really as supportive as they could be. Nothing that sounds like an instruction. Nothing that could be reported back, as an objection. Just a thought, offered with apparent concern for your well-being, that plants something small in the soil of how you see that relationship. You do not change anything immediately. The friendship continues, but something has shifted, almost imperceptibly, in how it sits with you. The next time that friend says something that could be read two ways, you find yourself reading it the less generous way. The next time plans are made, you feel slightly less pulled toward them. Nothing dramatic, just a degree of cooling that would be difficult to explain if someone asked you directly what had changed. And if they did ask, you would probably say, honestly, that you were not entirely sure. It just felt like the friendship had run its course. The relationship ended, and the person who redirected it never touched it directly. Isolation is almost never experienced as isolation while it is happening. That is the essential feature of how it works. Isolation experienced clearly, named accurately, in the moment it is occurring, is something a person can resist, escape, seek help about. But isolation that arrives as a series of individually reasonable adjustments, each one small enough to seem like ordinary life, each one leaving the person feeling as though their own choices are being made freely, that version is nearly invisible from the inside until the circle has already closed. The redirection happens through many routes. Sometimes it is the mild criticism of specific people, consistent enough to gradually reframe them as less trustworthy, less genuinely caring, less worth the investment of time. Sometimes it is the creation of conflict, small and engineered, that leaves the person feeling that a friendship ended naturally when it was actually nudged toward ending. Sometimes it is simpler than either of these. It is just the quiet occupation of time, a relationship that expands to fill the available hours, that creates enough plans and enough intimacy and enough immediate need that the other relationships in the circle simply starve for lack of attention, without anyone ever saying they should. What all of these share is the absence of a direct command. Nobody says, "Stop seeing your friends." Nobody issues an instruction that could be heard clearly and resisted clearly. The movement away from the circle is always presented as, and often genuinely felt to be, the person's own choice, their own gradual recognition that certain relationships were not serving them, their own natural drift toward the one relationship that seems to understand them most completely. The completeness of that one relationship is itself part of the architecture. The person doing the redirecting tends to offer something that the wider circle cannot easily match: a quality of attention, a depth of apparent understanding, the feeling of being known so specifically and valued so completely that other company begins to feel thin by comparison. Why spend time in relationships that offer a fraction of what this one offers? The logic is not unreasonable. The feeling is real. And both the logic and the feeling are products of a dynamic that was designed to produce exactly this conclusion. By the time the circle has genuinely contracted, the person inside the contraction often does not experience it as loss. They experience it as clarity, as having refined their life down to what actually matters, as having moved past relationships that were comfortable but not truly nourishing. The story of what happened has been written in a way that makes the ending feel chosen rather than engineered. And in a narrow technical sense, it was chosen, in the same sense that a person who has been guided to a particular door and told it is the only one worth opening has chosen to walk through it. The isolation becomes most visible in moments of crisis, when something goes wrong and the instinct to reach outward toward the wider world of people who might help or witness or simply be present is acted on and finds almost nothing there. The numbers are still in the phone perhaps, but the relationships have thinned. The ease of reaching out that used to exist has been replaced by an awkwardness born from long absence. And the person who is still there, the one the circle was contracted around, is now not just a relationship, but the primary resource, the main source of support, interpretation, comfort, and direction, which is exactly the position that was being built toward. Not in one move, not through force, but through the patient, incremental, almost invisible work of making one voice louder by making all the others quieter. The earliest sign is rarely the dramatic one. It is the small comment about a friend that you did not question as carefully as you might have. The mild redirection that you followed without noticing you were following. The moment when someone else's assessment of your relationship entered your mind and began doing your thinking for you. The circle does not close all at once. It closes one small distance at a time. And by the time you notice the quiet, a great deal of it has already been arranged. There is a particular kind of praise that leaves you feeling worse than you did before it arrived. Not obviously. Not in a way you can immediately explain or defend against. The words were positive. The tone was warm enough. Nobody watching from the outside would have registered anything other than one person saying something nice to another. And yet something landed underneath the niceness that the niceness itself was covering. A small hook, a suggestion, a comparison or a qualification, or a timing so precise that the compliment opened something rather than closing it. You looked great tonight. The tonight doing quiet work that great cannot undo. You are so much more capable than people expect. The expectation of others implied as low, now living in the compliment permanently. I had no idea you could do something like that. The surprise louder somehow than the admiration. Each one is technically positive. Each one would be difficult to object to without sounding oversensitive or ungrateful. And each one plants something that straightforward criticism never could, because criticism can be argued with, dismissed, attributed to the other person's limitations or bad faith. But praise disarms. Praise opens. Praise creates a moment of receptivity in which something can be placed that would not have found entry through any more direct route. The compliment with teeth is more precise than ordinary criticism because it requires knowing where a person is already uncertain about themselves. Genuine insecurity is the soil it needs. A person who is completely confident about their appearance will not feel the sting in tonight. A person who has never doubted their capability will not notice the surprise in "I had no idea." The weapon only works if it finds the existing wound, which means the person delivering it has been paying attention, has located the soft place, and has found a way to touch it while appearing to offer something kind. This is why it tends to come from people who know you. Strangers do not have the map. The person who has watched you across months or years, who has noted the specific insecurities you try to conceal, who knows which comparisons sting and which doubts sit closest to the surface. That person can aim in a way that a stranger cannot. And because they know you, because there is a history of genuine warmth alongside the moment of precision, the compliment arrives with a credibility that random criticism would never carry. The comparison version is particularly effective. You carry things so much better than most people would. The compliment is real enough, but most people has now entered the room. A population of people handling things worse has been conjured, and you are positioned above them, which sounds flattering until you notice what the positioning implies. That the standard being compared against was low, that the praise was calibrated to a floor rather than a ceiling, that what sounded like recognition of your strength was quietly a measurement of how far above ordinary you managed to get, rather than how high you actually reached. The timing version works differently, but just as precisely. The compliment delivered immediately before a request imports the praise into the negotiation that follows. You are so good at navigating difficult situations, which is immediately followed by a difficult situation being handed to you. Uses the compliment as a frame for compliance. Having just been told you are good at something, declining the opportunity to demonstrate it becomes harder. The praise was not a gift, it was a setup, and the setup was invisible because it wore the face of appreciation. What makes all of this so difficult to respond to clearly is the social cost of naming it. To say that compliment made me feel worse, or I noticed what the qualification was doing, or the surprise in your praise was louder than the praise itself, requires a confidence and a willingness to create friction that most people do not find easy, especially when the other person can simply look genuinely confused, can point to the positive words, and ask how anyone could take offense at kindness. The confusion, real or performed, puts the burden back on the recipient. Now they are the problem. Too sensitive, too suspicious, unable to receive appreciation graciously. And so the compliment lands, and the doubted installed stays, and nothing is said, and the person who offered it moves forward knowing the aim was accurate. The longer-term effect of receiving these regularly is a particular kind of wariness around praise that makes genuine appreciation hard to receive. The person who has been hit often enough through open doors begins to close them. Compliments that are entirely clean, offered by people with no intention except warmth, start to feel suspicious. The ear that learned to listen for the hidden qualification keeps listening even when there is none. Trust in positive regard becomes difficult to rebuild once it has been used often enough as a delivery mechanism for something else. There is a simple test that cuts through most of the complexity. Genuine praise leaves you feeling more solid than you were before it arrived. It closes something. It confirms something that needed confirming, and then releases you. It does not create new questions or reopen old ones, or leave behind a faint residue of something unresolved. The compliment with teeth feels like a gift while it is being handed over. And then you open it, and something inside it looks back at you.
There is a particular feeling that arrives with certain phone calls, certain messages, certain conversations that begin with a tone that tells you something is wrong before any content has been delivered. The body responds before the mind catches up. Something tightens. The ordinary pace of thought accelerates. The careful, deliberate processing that governs most decisions gets pushed to the side by something faster and more urgent, something that does not wait for all the information to arrive before it starts generating responses. This is the feeling that certain people have learned to produce on demand, not because an emergency exists, but because an emergency, real or manufactured, creates a cognitive state that is extraordinarily useful if what you want is a decision made quickly, made emotionally, and made before the person making it has had time to think carefully about whether it is the right one. Urgency is one of the oldest and most reliable ways to bypass careful thought. This is not because people are foolish. It is because the response to urgency was never designed for careful thought. It was designed for speed. When something genuinely threatening arrives, the capacity to pause and weigh options carefully is not an advantage. The animal that stopped to deliberate when the predator appeared did not survive long enough to develop better deliberation. The fast response, the one that acted before it reasoned, was the one that worked. And that fast response is still inside every human nervous system, still available, still capable of being triggered, still producing the same override of slower thinking that it always did. The manufactured emergency exploits this directly. It creates the felt conditions of genuine threat without the substance of it. A deadline that did not exist yesterday appears today with enormous urgency attached. A problem that has been simmering unremarked for weeks is suddenly presented as requiring immediate resolution. A decision that could reasonably take days or weeks to consider properly arrives with the message that it must be made now, today, this hour, before some unspecified but clearly terrible consequence arrives. The specifics matter less than the feeling they produce. What the urgency needs to generate is a narrowing of attention, a state in which the field of consideration contracts around the immediate problem, and the question of whether the urgency itself is real stops being asked. And this narrowing is not difficult to produce in people who are already somewhat tired, already somewhat stressed, already operating with less than their full capacity for careful thought, which, for most people, is most of the time. This is why certain sales tactics depend entirely on the scheduled emergency, the offer that expires today, specifically today, not tomorrow, not next week. The limited availability that happens to be running out at exactly the moment you are considering the purchase. The callback that creates a window of artificial scarcity around a decision that carries no natural deadline at all. The urgency is not informing you about the real conditions of the situation. It is managing the conditions of your thinking, making the slow, careful version unavailable by filling the available space with pressure. In personal relationships, the manufactured emergency is more intimate and therefore more effective. The person who can reliably produce a crisis at moments when a question is being asked, when accountability is approaching, when a decision is being weighed that they would prefer to influence, has a tool that is almost impossible to identify clearly while it is operating. Because the crisis, whatever form it takes, demands response, demands presence, demands that whatever was being carefully considered gets set aside in favor of the immediate need. And by the time the immediate need has been attended to, the original question has lost its momentum. The careful thought that was building has dissipated. The moment for clear decision has passed, quietly, while attention was elsewhere. The pattern, across time, looks like a relationship full of crises, one thing after another, each one legitimate enough in isolation, each one demanding the kind of focused, urgent attention that leaves no room for the slower conversations that never quite seem to find their moment. And the person moving from crisis to crisis alongside someone rarely stops to ask whether the frequency is natural or whether the emergencies are arriving with a consistency and a timing that serves something. Because emergencies do not usually have timing. Real ones arrive without regard for what else is happening. They interrupt inconveniently, at random, without pattern. The emergencies that arrive precisely when accountability is near, precisely when an important question is being raised, precisely when a decision is being made that requires careful, independent thought, those have a different quality. Not the randomness of genuine crisis, but the regularity of something that is being reached for. The recovery of careful thought after urgency has been triggered is slower than most people realize. The narrowing that urgency produces does not simply reverse when the immediate pressure lifts. Something of the heightened state remains, the slightly elevated vigilance, the contracted field of attention, the residual feeling that things are not quite stable, which means the decision made in the aftermath of a manufactured emergency is not being made from a fully restored position. It is being made from a person still partly inside the state the emergency created. The clearest protection is the simplest one and the hardest to apply in the moment. When urgency arrives, ask what is actually lost by waiting, not what the person presenting the urgency says is lost. What is actually verifiably, concretely lost by taking one more day. Most scheduled emergencies cannot answer that question, because they were never about the deadline. They were about the state the deadline puts you in.
There is a conversation that happens sometimes between people who have known each other a long time. You are talking about something from the past, a shared event, a moment you both witnessed, and the other person remembers it differently. Not dramatically differently, just a detail or two, a slight shift in sequence, a different quality to how something felt. And because they say it with confidence, because they were there too, because memory is already an uncertain thing, and you know this about yourself, you begin to wonder. Maybe they are right. Maybe what you remember is slightly off. Maybe the version they are offering is the more accurate one. You update, not dramatically. You simply hold the memory a little more loosely now than you did before the conversation. You have incorporated their version into your own, partially, in the way you might incorporate any new information that arrives from a source you trust. This is ordinary and mostly harmless. Memory is collaborative in the way that most human knowledge is collaborative, built partly from what you experienced and partly from what others have helped you understand about what you experienced. The problem is not that other people influence memory. The problem is that this ordinary and mostly harmless process can be used deliberately, with precision, to build memories that were never yours, and to dismantle memories that were. The planted memory does not usually arrive as an obvious insertion. It arrives as a question. Do you remember how anxious you were that day? A question that assumes the anxiety, that places it in the past as an established fact, that invites you not to evaluate whether the anxiety existed, but simply to locate it in your memory. If you cannot locate it clearly, if the memory is soft enough around the edges, the question itself begins to function as evidence. You cannot find the anxiety, but perhaps that is because you are not remembering it correctly. The person asking was there. They seemed certain. The certainty of someone present carries more weight than the uncertainty of your own imperfect recall. And so you look again, and this time, perhaps you find something. Not because it was there originally, but because the looking was shaped by the suggestion. The memory of the day now contains something anxiety adjacent that it did not contain clearly before the question was asked. The past has been revised, and the revision feels from the inside, like remembering more accurately, rather than like accepting someone else's insertion. This is possible because of the same feature of memory that was explored earlier in this longer conversation. Memory is reconstructed each time it is accessed. It uses current information, current framing, current emotional context to reassemble what happened, which means current suggestion can be woven into the reconstruction, in ways that are genuinely difficult to detect. The suggestion does not feel like an addition. It feels like a recovery, like finally finding something that was always there but not fully accessed. The repetition version works more slowly, but reaches further. A version of the past, told often enough by someone trusted, builds across time the way any repeated exposure builds. The first time you hear that you were always the difficult one in the family, some part of you might resist. The fifth time, delivered in the same tone, referencing the same examples, met with the same nodding agreement from others who have also heard it. The resistance has tired. The version has accumulated. It does not feel like something being installed. It feels like something finally being acknowledged. The stakes of this go beyond individual memories, because memories are not just records of what happened. They are the raw material from which a person understands who they are, what they are capable of, what they have survived, and what they deserve. A systematically revised personal history produces a systematically revised self. The person who has been helped to remember themselves as more fragile than they were moves through the present as a fragile person. The person who has been helped to remember a relationship as better than it was grieves something that did not quite exist. The person who has been helped to forget the evidence of their own strength does not reach for it when it would serve them. The deliberate version of this, the kind that is done with full awareness of what is being constructed, tends to have a direction. The memories being planted or revised serve a purpose. They produce a version of the past in which the person doing the planting appears more necessary, more central, more benevolent than the unrevised version would support. They produce a version of the recipient that makes them more dependent, more doubtful of their own perception, more reliant on the trusted source to tell them what was real. Trust is the essential ingredient. Without it, the suggestions do not take. A stranger telling you that you were anxious that day would not find purchase. But a person you love, a person you have organized part of your sense of reality around, that person's version of the past arrives with an authority that bypasses the ordinary skepticism you would apply to less trusted sources. Which is why the question of who has been helping you remember your own life is not a small one. Not every influence on memory is manipulation, but some of it is, and the two feel identical while they are happening. The difference only appears later, when you look at what the revised version required you to believe about yourself, and whether what it required made you larger or smaller than you were before.
There is a comment that arrives early in certain relationships or certain conversations that does not announce its weight at the time. It is said casually, almost in passing, in the tone of someone simply observing rather than declaring. You have always been someone who struggles with commitment, or said with apparent warmth, "You are not really a risk-taker at heart, are you?" Or something smaller still, a slight raising of an eyebrow, accompanied by the words, "Are you sure that is something you could actually sustain?" Nothing about the delivery suggests importance. The conversation moves on, the moment passes, and if you were asked an hour later whether anything significant had been said, you might struggle to point to it. It felt like nothing, it landed like nothing, but it stayed. Not in the way that dramatic statements stay, not with a clear address in memory that can be revisited and examined. It stayed in the quieter way that early framings stay, woven into the background of subsequent thinking, operating not as a memory, but as an atmosphere, a slight but persistent lean in a particular direction. And the decisions that followed, made in that atmosphere, carried the lean without knowing they were carrying it. This is a more targeted version of the anchoring that an earlier chapter explored. That chapter concerned the way first numbers and first descriptions create reference points that all subsequent judgment measures itself against. This version is narrower, and in some ways more insidious because it is personal. It is not a number on a price tag or a description of a stranger. It is a statement about you, delivered by someone in your life at a moment when you were not specifically guarding against the possibility of being shaped. The offhand quality is essential to how it works. A direct statement of limitation invites direct response. If someone sits you down and formally tells you that you are not capable of sustained commitment, something in you rises to meet it. You might agree or disagree, but you engage. You bring your own evidence. The conversation becomes one in which the claim is at least visible as a claim, available to be examined and disputed. But the comment delivered in passing, in a light tone, woven into a larger conversation about something else entirely, slips past that engagement. There is nothing to push back against because nothing was formally asserted. It was just a thought, just an observation, barely worth noting. And yet noting is exactly what the mind did, quietly and without announcing it. The personal anchor works by recruiting your own thinking to do its work. Once the idea has entered that you are not a risk taker, that commitment is difficult for you, that a certain kind of sustained effort is probably beyond what you can reliably manage, the mind begins to process subsequent experience through it. A moment of genuine hesitation becomes evidence. A difficulty that anyone would have faced becomes confirmation. The times you pushed through, the commitments you held, the risks you took and managed well, those get filed as exceptions, as not quite counting, as the kind of thing that proves the rule by sitting outside it. The anchor does not argue with you. It does not need to. It simply weights things in one direction consistently and invisibly, and over time, the cumulative weight of that consistent pressure begins to feel like your own considered understanding of yourself. Not something that was placed in you, something you discovered, something the evidence has consistently supported, something that would feel strange and almost dishonest to contradict. The person who dropped the anchor may not have done it with full awareness of the mechanism. Some people speak from their own limited perception of you, and the limitation is genuine, if inaccurate. Others speak from something more purposeful, an understanding that a person carrying a particular belief about their own capacity will make different choices, smaller choices, choices that keep them closer and more manageable than a person who believes they are capable of more. The anchor keeps the boat in a useful place, not through force, through the boat's own belief that it cannot travel further. Children carry anchors dropped by parents who did not understand what they were dropping. Adults carry anchors placed by partners, by early managers, by a single teacher whose offhand assessment of their ability arrived at exactly the age when such assessments have the most formative power. The anchor has often been in place so long that the person has completely ceased to experience it as external. It has become self-knowledge. It has become the realistic and grounded understanding of their own limits that they believe careful self-reflection produced. Recognizing an anchor requires a specific kind of backward looking, not a general review of your self-beliefs, but a more curious examination of where particular beliefs came from. Not what do I believe about myself, but when did I start believing this, and what was happening when it arrived, and who was in the room. Because the beliefs that arrived in passing, in someone else's light conversational tone, were never subjected to the scrutiny that beliefs arrived at through genuine reflection were. They entered without examination. They stayed without challenge, and they have been doing their work ever since in the place where your sense of what is possible quietly lives. The anchor feels like the bottom, like the actual limit of the depth available to you. It is worth checking whether someone else dropped it there, or whether the water is deeper than it taught you to believe. There is a relationship most people have either lived or watched someone they care about live. From the outside, it makes very little sense. The person inside it is clearly not consistently happy. The relationship brings genuine pain with a regularity that any observer can see plainly. And yet the attachment is fierce. Fiercer somehow than the attachments formed in easier relationships. In the ones with less turbulence and more reliable warmth, leaving seems impossible in a way that genuinely happy relationships never produce. The very difficulty of it appears to deepen the hold rather than loosen it. The people inside these relationships often explain it as love, as something so strong it transcends ordinary comfort, as a connection too real and too deep to be measured against something as simple as whether it feels good on a given day. And they are not entirely wrong. What they feel is real. The attachment is genuine. The intensity is not performed. What they are usually not told is why the intensity is there. And the why, once understood, changes the picture entirely. The nervous system does not attach most deeply to what is consistently pleasant. It attaches most deeply to what is unpredictable. This is not a character flaw or a sign of damage, though damage can amplify it. It is a feature of how reward systems in the brain were built. Consistent reward, the same good thing arriving reliably at predictable intervals, produces comfort and appreciation, but not obsession. The brain calibrates to it. The reward stops producing the same intensity of response, because the response has been optimized for an expected outcome. Predictability is comfortable, but it does not produce the neurological state that feels, from the inside, like passionate attachment. Unpredictable reward produces something different entirely. When warmth arrives inconsistently, when love comes in waves rather than steadily, when closeness is available sometimes and withdrawn at others without clear pattern, the brain does not calibrate and settle. It activates. It produces the heightened alertness of a system that has learned it cannot predict when the good thing will arrive, and must therefore remain vigilant, attentive, perpetually oriented toward the source of the intermittent reward. The good moments, when they come, feel disproportionately intense, precisely because their arrival was not guaranteed. The relief of warmth returning after its absence carries a sweetness that consistent warmth never quite reaches. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling so difficult to stop. Not the wins, which are real but not sufficient on their own, but the unpredictability of when the wins will arrive. The interval between rewards, when it varies, produces a state of anticipation and vigilance that fixed intervals simply do not. The brain becomes organized around the source of the unpredictable reward in a way that feels from the inside like caring very deeply, like being unable to look away, like something that must be near completion, even when every rational signal says it is not. In a relationship, the waves of warmth function the same way. The person who is sometimes loving and sometimes cold, sometimes present and sometimes withdrawn, sometimes generous and sometimes withholding, without any reliable pattern that would allow the other person to predict which version will arrive today, produces in their partner a state of permanent attentiveness. The partner becomes exquisitely attuned to shifts in mood, highly sensitive to signals of approaching warmth or approaching coldness, perpetually working to understand the pattern, to find the behavior that reliably produces the good version, to avoid the behavior that produces the withdrawal. This work feels like love. It involves all the attention and effort and emotional investment that love involves, but it is not primarily organized around genuine connection. It is organized around regulation of the other person's inconsistency, around the management of an unpredictable source. And the management is exhausting in a way that genuine love, for all its difficulty, is not. The coldness is as essential to the mechanism as the warmth. Without the withdrawal, there is no contrast, and without contrast, the warmth loses its disproportionate impact. It is the waves themselves, the movement between the states, that produces the depth of attachment, which means a relationship that felt this way was not accidentally inconsistent. The inconsistency, whether designed or simply the expression of an unexamined pattern, was doing specific work. Work that consistent kindness, for all its genuine value, could never have done. People who grew up with inconsistent warmth from early caregivers are more vulnerable to this, because the pattern is already familiar. The nervous system learned early that love feels like this, that the vigilant waiting and the relief of return and the sharp sweetness of warmth after absence is what closeness feels like. And when an adult relationship reproduces that texture, it does not feel like a warning. It feels like recognition, like the particular comfort of a familiar thing, even when the familiar thing was never quite safe. Recognizing the mechanism does not dissolve the attachment. The brain does not release its hold simply because the mind understands why the hold is there. But understanding changes something. It changes the story. The intensity stops being evidence of unique and irreplaceable love and starts being recognizable as the predictable output of a particular kind of inconsistency. The attachment was real. The feeling was genuine. The wave was. And the wave was not random. It never is. There is a particular kind of difficult conversation that leaves you feeling like you lost something you cannot quite name. Not an argument exactly, because argument implies two people exchanging positions with roughly equal footing. Something more one-sided than that. You went in with a feeling, a genuine one, something that had been building long enough to finally need saying. And you came out with the feeling dismantled, not addressed, not heard and responded to honestly. Dismantled, piece by piece, calmly, with a patience that somehow felt more aggressive than anger would have, until the thing you came in holding had been reduced to something small and slightly embarrassing that you were almost apologizing for having raised. The person across from you never raised their voice. They were never unkind in any way you could point to. They were, by any visible measure, the more reasonable person in the room. That is exactly what made it so effective. Reasonableness is one of the most powerful social currencies available. A person who remains calm while others are emotional is granted automatically and almost universally a degree of credibility that the emotional person is simultaneously losing. The culture around most conflict, in most contexts, assigns virtue to the composed and suspicion to the activated. Calm reads as clarity, distress reads as distortion. And this assignment happens before the content of what either person is saying has been examined at all. The person who understands this and has learned, consciously or through long practice, to deploy composure as a tool has access to something that straightforward aggression never provides. They can cause harm and simultaneously occupy the position of the person least likely to be identified as causing it. Every response to their behavior that carries any emotional charge becomes, in the framing they provide, evidence of the other person's instability, rather than evidence of anything they themselves have done. The calmer they remain while the other person grows more distressed, the more the distress itself becomes the story. The logic version works the same way, an argument constructed carefully with apparent internal consistency that leads through a sequence of individually reasonable-sounding steps to a conclusion that serves the arguer, is very difficult to resist in the moment without seeming irrational. Each step sounds reasonable, each transition sounds fair. The conclusion arrives wearing the same clothes as the premises, and it takes a specific kind of clarity, difficult to access when you are already somewhat destabilized, to identify where the logic quietly slipped and who it was serving. You can feel the shape of this in the aftermath of certain conversations. You accepted something you did not quite agree with because you could not find the specific point where the reasoning went wrong, only the feeling that something had. You gave ground not because you were convinced, but because the argument had a surface that looked like good faith, and dismantling it would have required a sustained effort that the pace of the conversation did not allow. You walked away with a vague sense of having been moved somewhere you did not choose to go, by a route that looked from each individual step like reasonable ground. The most effective version of this combines calm delivery with a particular kind of reframing. Your concern gets acknowledged, but immediately repositioned. What you called a pattern gets described as a series of unrelated incidents. What you called consistent becomes in the retelling a misinterpretation caused by your own sensitivity or stress or history. Your perception is not directly attacked. That would create a visible target. It is gently questioned, given an alternative explanation that sounds, in the moment, as plausible as your own. And the alternative explanation conveniently locates the problem inside you, rather than in the behavior you were describing. This is the gaslighting that does not feel like gaslighting, while it is happening, because it arrives in such reasonable clothes. It does not tell you that you are crazy. It simply offers calmly and with apparent care a version of events in which your reading of things is the variable most in need of examination. And because it is offered calmly, with logic, with the apparent generosity of someone who is trying to help you see more clearly, the offer is much harder to refuse than an obvious attack would be. The long-term effect of being in sustained contact with this kind of reasonableness is a specific erosion, not of any single belief, but of trust in your own perception as a reliable instrument. You begin to front-load the other person's interpretation before you have even finished forming your own. You start to suspect your feelings before you have examined them. The internal process of moving from something felt to something said develops an extra step, an automatic submission of the felt thing to the imagined judgment of the reasonable person before it is allowed to be expressed. And the reasonable person by this point does not need to be in the room. They have been installed inside your own thinking, their calm voice arriving before yours, questioning what you were about to say, suggesting that perhaps you are reading it wrong, perhaps you are reacting from something old, perhaps the more measured interpretation is the one that deserves more weight. A monster that arrives loudly can be identified and named. Everyone in the room sees what it is. The reasonable monster is harder. It sits across from you in good lighting, speaking in even tones, never doing anything that could be pointed to, and leaves you wondering on the way home whether the problem was you all along.
There is a particular reassurance that people carry in difficult situations, a quiet background belief that functions as a kind of safety valve, releasing just enough pressure to make the present bearable. It is the belief that they could leave, that the door exists, that the situation is a choice, freely made and freely reversible, and that the fact of staying is therefore not something to examine too closely, because it is not a trap, it is a preference. They are here because they want to be here. They could go at any time. The exit is right there. The belief in the exit changes everything about how the situation gets assessed. A trap requires urgent response. A choice requires nothing except the ongoing exercise of that choice. And so long as the belief in the exit is intact, the urgency that might otherwise prompt a serious examination of whether the situation is actually serving them stays quiet. There is no need to assess a door you could walk through whenever you wanted. The most elegant version of control does not lock the door. It leaves the door visibly open while making the walking through it feel impossible. Not through force, not through explicit threat, but through the careful cultivation of conditions that make leaving feel more costly than staying, while the person inside never quite examines whether the cost was real or constructed. The costs take many forms, and they are rarely introduced all at once. They accumulate the way most effective constraints accumulate, gradually, each addition individually reasonable, each one justifiable in isolation, until the total weight is enormous, and the process of getting there is too spread across time to be clearly traced. Financial dependency that develops slowly through a series of individually logical steps until the practical reality of leaving carries a price that feels prohibitive. Social dependency, the circle narrowed in the way an earlier chapter explored, until the prospect of leaving means facing a world in which the primary support structure is the thing being left. Identity dependency, the self-concept reshaped to fit the relationship so thoroughly that the question of who you are outside it has no clear answer. Each of these makes the exit feel real in theory and impossible in practice. The door has not been locked, but standing at it, looking through it, the world on the other side looks cold and uncertain, and emptier than the difficult world on this side. Because the difficult world on this side is at least known, and the cold, uncertain world on the other side is not. And the mind, which has already shown its preference for the familiar over the unknown in almost every chapter of this longer conversation, chooses the difficult familiar over the uncertain unknown, without ever quite registering that the choice was shaped before it was made. The illusion of choice serves the person maintaining the situation because it also serves as a permanent deflection of accountability. If you could leave and you have not left, the staying must be evidence of your own assessment that things are acceptable. The staying becomes consent, and consent forecloses most of the available language for describing what the situation actually is. How can it be a trap if the door is open? How can there be harm if you are choosing to remain? The open door does not just keep you inside, it keeps you from accurately naming what keeping you inside looks like. This is why the question of whether an exit is real requires more than looking at whether a door exists. It requires examining what has been built on either side of it. Whether the conditions that made the exit unthinkable arrived naturally or were cultivated. Whether the dependencies that make leaving feel impossible were always there, or developed inside the relationship in ways that now, looking back, seem to have followed a direction. Real exits do not require that everything be easy. Leaving difficult situations is almost always genuinely hard, and that hardness is not evidence of a constructed trap. The distinction sits somewhere more specific. It sits in whether the hardness of leaving was a feature of the situation that was managed in from outside, through the slow construction of costs that made the exit less and less real over time. There is a version of this that operates at scales beyond individual relationships. The employment situation where the benefits, the specific pension, the particular insurance, the years invested, are structured in a way that leaving would cost more than most people can bear, regardless of whether the situation itself deserves staying in. The community or belief system where the cost of exit is social death, the loss of every relationship built inside the structure, making the door technically open and practically sealed. In each case, the mechanism is the same. The exit is visible. The exit is real in the narrow sense that no physical barrier exists. And the exit is not available in the sense that actually matters, which is the sense of being genuinely reachable by the person standing in front of it. The first honest question is not whether you could leave. It is whether you could leave without losing something that was built inside this situation, specifically to make sure you could not. Because the door being open is not the same as the door being available. And the belief that you could walk through it at any time is sometimes the most load-bearing thing in the whole structure. The thing that makes every other constraint unnecessary. because you never push against a wall you believe is a door.
There is a dynamic that takes time to recognize because it feels while you are inside it like simply being in a relationship with someone who knows you well. They seem to understand your patterns. They can predict how you will respond to things. They reference your history with a familiarity that feels like intimate knowledge, like the natural product of having been known by someone across enough time that they have genuinely learned your shape. And in the beginning, this feels good. Being known has a warmth to it. Being seen accurately, or feeling accurately seen, is one of the things people want most from the people closest to them. But somewhere along the way, if you pay close attention, you notice that the knowing has a particular quality. It does not update. New information about you does not seem to revise it. When you behave in a way that contradicts the pattern they have identified, the contradiction does not register as new data. It gets explained away, folded back into the existing picture, treated as temporary or superficial, or as further evidence of the pattern itself, just a reaction to the pattern rather than a departure from it. The knowing, you eventually realize, is not actually tracking you. It is tracking a character, a fixed character that was decided on at some point and has been maintained since, regardless of what you have actually done. You have been cast, and the casting happened without an audition. Every person who tells stories about their life needs other people to fill the roles the story requires, not through any conscious scheming, most of the time, but through the ordinary way that human beings make sense of their experience by giving it a narrative shape. The hero of a story needs supporting characters, needs someone who doubted them and was proven wrong, needs someone who needed saving, needs someone whose limitations provide contrast for the hero's growth, needs often a person whose reliable dysfunction makes the hero's own struggles more legible and more sympathetic. These roles do not get advertised. They get assigned through the accumulated weight of how someone is treated, talked about, and responded to across time. The person cast as the fragile one finds that their competence is consistently underestimated, and their difficulties consistently highlighted. The person cast as the difficult one finds that their reasonable objections get framed as problems, and their moments of clarity get overlooked. The person cast as the dependent one finds that their independence is subtly discouraged, and their need is subtly amplified. None of these castings require a single explicit statement. They are maintained through 1,000 small interactions that each, individually, could be explained as something else. The role shapes behavior over time because human beings are responsive to the social reality around them. A person consistently treated as fragile begins to perform fragility, not through dishonesty, but through the ordinary psychological process of internalizing the responses of the people they trust. A person consistently cast as the one who needs guidance begins to reach for guidance even in situations where their own judgment would serve them well. The role is reinforced until the person wearing it begins to experience it as simply who they are, not a costume, their actual self. What makes this most difficult to see is the partial truth it usually contains. The casting tends to take a real quality and amplify it beyond its natural proportion, or take a real difficulty and freeze it in time, refusing to allow it to evolve. The person who was genuinely struggling at some point becomes, in someone else's narrative, a person who is always struggling, constitutionally, without possibility of revision. The real thing in the original observation provides the credibility that keeps the role feeling accurate, even as the person has moved well past it. There is a particular loneliness in being cast in someone else's story that is hard to articulate while you are inside it. It feels like being seen, but it is actually the opposite of being seen. Being seen requires the other person to remain genuinely curious about who you are now, today, in this conversation, as distinct from who you were or who they need you to be. The casting removes that curiosity. It already knows what you are. It is simply waiting for you to confirm it. The casting also tends to be self-reinforcing in the social environment around it. The story gets told to others, the role gets established in a wider circle, and now the social world around you is organized around a character with your name and your face, and navigating that world while actually being yourself requires a sustained counter-narrative effort that is exhausting to maintain indefinitely. It is easier, much easier, to simply become the character, to stop the effort of being something more complicated than the role allows. Recognizing that you have been cast does not require a dramatic confrontation with the person who cast you. It requires something quieter and more personal than that. It requires sitting with the question of which parts of how you are seen by the people closest to you feel like genuine recognition, and which parts feel like a fixed frame that your actual behavior has stopped being able to move. The role that no longer fits is information, not about who you were when someone first saw you and decided what to make of you, but about the distance between that moment and this one, and about how much of yourself you may have quietly set down to fit inside a story that was never really about you. There is a specific kind of conversation that can create the feeling of deep connection in a remarkably short amount of time. You are talking with someone, perhaps someone you do not know very well yet, and they begin to speak about someone or something with a particular candor. A shared frustration, a person in your mutual orbit who has apparently revealed themselves to be less than they appeared. A system or institution that has shown its true nature to anyone paying close enough attention, and something in you responds, not just to the content but to the act of the sharing itself. This person is being honest with me. They trust me with this. They see what I see. The bond that forms in that moment feels earned. It feels like the product of genuine perception shared between two people who are both clear-eyed enough to see the same thing. Mutual recognition of a truth that not everyone would acknowledge. And that feeling of being part of a seeing pair, of standing on the same ground with someone while others stand elsewhere, is one of the fastest routes to a felt sense of closeness that human social experience contains, which is precisely why it is one of the most reliably used. Shared enemies create bonds faster than shared values because they require less. Shared values need to be discovered gradually, tested against each other, refined through real experience of how each person actually behaves when the values are in tension with something easier. That process takes time and genuine exposure. Shared resentment requires only agreement, only the nod, only the small signal that yes, I see it too. The bond snaps into place before either person has demonstrated anything about who they actually are, or how they actually behave when things are difficult. The speed is the danger, because a bond formed this quickly, on this particular foundation, carries a weight it has not yet earned. The closeness feels real, and in its way it is real, but it has been produced by a shortcut that bypasses the slower verification that genuine trust requires. And the person who understands how to use this shortcut can manufacture closeness on demand, with almost anyone, by finding the resentment that is available in almost every person and providing the validation that makes it feel like connection. Everyone has frustrations. Everyone has people who have disappointed them, institutions that have failed them, situations where they felt unseen or treated unfairly. This is simply the ordinary texture of a life spent among other imperfect people in imperfect systems. The raw material for shared resentment is never difficult to locate. The skill, if it can be called that, lies in finding it quickly, amplifying it carefully, and positioning oneself as the person who not only shares the feeling, but has always shared it. Who saw what you saw before you even said it. Who is therefore clearly someone who understands you in a way that others do not. Once the bond is in place, built on the shared enemy, it carries a particular kind of leverage. The shared resentment becomes a reference point for the relationship, a foundation that can be returned to whenever the bond needs reinforcing, or whenever something is needed from the person it was built with. More than that, the bond now has an implicit loyalty structure. Shared enemies create in-groups and out-groups, and the logic of in-group loyalty is powerful and largely automatic. Criticizing the shared enemy strengthens the bond. Defending them, or simply failing to criticize them with sufficient enthusiasm, becomes a small betrayal, a signal of misalignment, a crack in the common ground. This is how the manufactured bond becomes a managed one. The shared enemy has to stay an enemy. Nuance about them, sympathy toward them, any movement toward a more complicated view of them, threatens the foundation the relationship was built on. The person who built the relationship on this foundation has an interest, conscious or not, in keeping the resentment alive, in refreshing it when it begins to fade, in finding new evidence of the enemy's unworthiness when the old evidence is losing its charge. The bond requires maintenance, and the maintenance looks like the perpetual renewal of the shared grievance. What this produces over time is a relationship oriented around what it is against rather than what it is for. A connection that requires a third party, always the villain, to hold it together, and a person inside it who finds that their own view of the world has gradually aligned with the person who first offered them the shared enemy. who has adopted not just the resentment, but the framing that comes with it. The way of seeing that identifies the same kinds of enemies in new situations, that finds the same patterns of betrayal in new people, that is always ready with the same emotional response when the familiar shape of the villain appears. The bond felt like recognition, like meeting someone who saw clearly, and it produced across time a narrowing of what could be seen. Genuine connection is built towards something. It carries a generosity, an orientation toward the world that includes more rather than less, that opens rather than closes. The connection built on shared enemies moves in the opposite direction. It gathers you inward, into a smaller and smaller circle of the trustworthy, until the person who drew the circle is the only one left inside it. And by then, the walls feel like safety.
It does not usually happen all at once. That is the first thing worth saying. The moment of seeing is rarely a single dramatic flash, a sudden revelation that arrives complete and fully formed. It is more often an accumulation, a series of smaller noticings, each one insufficient on its own, that reach a kind of critical mass at some unremarkable moment. A sentence said in a particular tone, a pattern repeating for the 100th time in a way that the previous 99 times somehow did not quite reveal. A quiet morning where nothing specific happens except that something you have been almost seeing for a long time finally comes into focus, and then you see it. The strings. The word strings is the right one because of what it captures. Not chains, not a cage, not anything so dramatic or so obviously constraining. Strings are subtle. Strings move you in ways that look, from the outside and often from the inside, like your own movement. When you were inside the pattern, when the strings were doing their work without your awareness, you were not experiencing yourself as controlled. You were experiencing yourself as choosing, as thinking your own thoughts, feeling your own feelings, arriving at your own conclusions. The strings were invisible, not because you were careless, but because invisible is exactly what they were designed to be, what they had to be to work at all. The seeing changes that, and the change is not comfortable, not at first, not for a long time, because seeing the strings means seeing backward. It means looking at the history of the relationship, the years of accumulated interaction, and understanding that a significant portion of what felt like authentic experience was shaped in ways you were not aware of. The decisions that felt free were influenced. The feelings that felt entirely yours were partly produced. The version of yourself you developed inside that dynamic was built partly from materials someone else selected. All of that was real while it was happening. The feelings were genuine. The love, if there was love, was not fake. But underneath the genuine things, the strings were moving, and the movement left its marks across years of your life. This is the loss, and it is a real loss, and it deserves to be called one. Not a performed grief, not an exaggerated wound, but the honest recognition that something was taken that cannot be given back. Time that moved in directions it might not have moved. A self that developed around a shape that was not freely chosen. Choices made from a map that was drawn by someone else and handed to you as though it were the actual territory. The loss is not small, and the temptation to make it smaller than it is, in the interest of moving on quickly or avoiding the full weight of it, is worth resisting. It needs to be felt at something close to its actual size. But the seeing is also something else. Something that arrives alongside the loss, not instead of it. A very specific kind of freedom that is only available on the other side of understanding. Before you saw the strings, you could not question them. You could not examine the influence because you did not know it was there. The patterns ran because they were invisible, and invisible patterns run without resistance, without examination, without any possibility of interruption. The moment of seeing ends that. Not the patterns themselves, not immediately. Behavior built across years does not dissolve in a single moment of clarity, but the invisibility ends. And the end of invisibility is the beginning of something that was not available before. You can now notice. You can catch the familiar pull and recognize it before it completes. You can feel the old response forming and ask for the first time with any real access to the answer, whether this is actually what you want to do or whether it is what you were shaped to do. That question could not be asked before, It had no traction. The mechanism was below the level where questions could reach it. Now it is not. This is what makes the seeing of freedom, even when it feels like devastation. Not the freedom of having escaped, not the freedom of the wound being healed, but the freedom of the mechanism being visible, which is the only kind of freedom that was ever actually available. The complete freedom from influence does not exist. There is no position outside all shaping, no self so thoroughly examined that nothing runs below its awareness. Every chapter in this longer conversation has circled that same truth from different directions. The lens cannot be fully removed. The strings cannot all be seen at once, but some of them can be, the ones you have now seen. And that is not nothing. That is the difference between a life lived entirely inside the pattern and a life in which the pattern can be, at least sometimes, chosen or refused. The difference between being moved and deciding whether to move. The grief and the freedom are not opposites in this moment. They are the same thing experienced from two angles. The grief is for what the seeing reveals about the past. The freedom is what the seeing makes possible in everything that comes after. You will not unsee the strings. That is the final thing worth knowing. Some doors, once opened, do not close. The vision that arrived, however unwelcome, has become part of how you see. The world looks different now, not darker exactly, but more textured, more complex, more honest about what has always been operating beneath the surface of ordinary life. And you, looking at it, are more yourself than you were before you looked. Not despite the loss, because of it.